There's a voice line from Dawn of War that sounds like it was delivered by someone receiving divine revelation. It is the Baneblade. Not an announcement, a declaration that whatever was happening before this moment no longer matters, that the tactical situation has been permanently reclassified, that the battlefield has a new center of gravity and everything else is now orbiting it. That response is the correct one. It has always been the correct one. The Baneblade's physical statistics tell part of the story. 316 tons of STC-engineered steel, 13.5 meters in length, 8.4 meters wide, 6.3 meters high. A machine large enough that when it rolls past infantry, soldiers look up at its sponsons the way pedestrians look up at building facades. The size is real, the weight is real, but fixating on those numbers misses what makes the Baneblade genuinely different from simply describing a large armored vehicle. Because the Baneblade isn't primarily defined by its dimensions, it's defined by its age. The design predates the Great Crusade. That sentence requires a pause to absorb properly. The Great Crusade, the Emperor's campaign of reunification, the founding era of the Imperium of man, the moment when humanity reached across the galaxy and reclaimed what the Age of Strife had fragmented. That event happened after the Baneblade already existed. The machine that Astra Militarum regiments field in the 41st millennium was designed during the dark age of technology, humanity's pre-collapse golden era, when standard template constructs preserved engineering knowledge of a sophistication that the current Imperium treats as essentially miraculous. When the official sources describe the Baneblade as one of the oldest standard template construct designs still in active service, they're not reaching for poetic effect. They're stating a categorical fact about where this vehicle sits in humanity's technological timeline. The standard template construct program is one of the most consequential things in the entire 40K universe, and it's worth understanding properly to grasp why the Baneblade's STC designation matters. During the Age of Technology, the STC system was designed to allow any human colony in the galaxy to build anything civilization required: shelters, vehicles, weapons, infrastructure, from locally available materials. Every STC contained the complete engineering knowledge for its subject, not just the blueprints, but the manufacturing processes, the material specifications, the maintenance protocols, the detailed reasoning behind every design decision. An intact STC gave you everything you needed to not just build the item, but to understand it. The current Imperium doesn't have intact STCs. It has fragments. It has partial data that Forge Worlds treat as sacred scripture and argue over for centuries. The Adeptus Mechanicus would commit civilizational atrocities to recover a single previously unknown STC fragment, because even incomplete knowledge from the Golden Age is worth more than anything the current era can independently produce. The STC for the Baneblade exists in sufficient form to allow continued maintenance and limited production, and that fact alone makes the vehicle an object of theological significance to the Mechanicus. This is why tech priests don't simply service Baneblades. They approach the maintenance hatches with established rites. They address the machine's systems through litanies. When a tech priest lifts the cover on a Baneblade's engine block, he's performing an act that exists somewhere between engineering and prayer, because the design knowledge he's working with comes from an era of such superior understanding that he can replicate the procedures without fully comprehending the principles behind them. The Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't maintain Baneblades the way a mechanic maintains a car. They maintain Baneblades the way a medieval monk copies a manuscript he can't fully read, faithfully, reverently, and with a perpetual awareness that the text contains depths he doesn't have the tools to plumb. During the Great Crusade, these machines were produced in the tens of thousands, forged on Mars and across the Forge Worlds that supplied the Exertus Imperialis, the pre-imperial guard military that carried humanity's banner during the expansion phase. The Baneblade was deployed in numbers that current-era Imperial commanders would find incomprehensible. Not preserved in vaults, not escorted across systems in protected convoy. Used. In the field, by the tens of thousands, fielded and lost and replaced and fielded again. Because when the STC infrastructure is operational and the production lines are running and the Imperium is at the height of its golden age, the question isn't, can we afford to lose one? The question is, how many does this campaign require? The answer the 41st Millennium gives to that question is 5 to 10. Individual Imperial Guard regiments in the current era typically possess 5 to 10 Baneblades. Not 5 to 10,000, 5 to 10 total across an entire regiment's order of battle. The community developed a joke around this fact. Yeah, we have about 10 billion of those. And it's accurate in the way the best dark humor is accurate. It captures the mathematical insult. The Imperium knows with precision what it had. It knows with equal precision what it has. Tens of thousands became 5 to 10, not through enemy action or deliberate policy, but through the slow attrition of an empire in a 10,000-year decline, losing each Baneblade to battle damage and circumstance, while the replacement capacity quietly degraded below the replacement demand. Every Baneblade that goes down in M41 has to be recovered, transported to a forge world, and restored through a process that takes years and resources the Mechanicus does not spend lightly. Every loss is permanent in a way the Great Crusade era losses never were. The Golden Age is over with a thoroughness that 5 to 10 per regiment makes viscerally legible. The machine itself commands attention before any broader argument can be built around it. A formidable array of weapon systems integrated into a single hull, not bolted on as afterthoughts, but designed as a coherent weapons architecture that allows the Baneblade to engage multiple threat categories simultaneously across different ranges and engagement planes. Starting with the primary weapon, the Mega Battle Cannon, capable of projecting devastation at ranges that make most armored engagements irrelevant before the opposition has processed that contact has been made. The sound of a Baneblade's main cannon firing reportedly carries for several kilometers beyond the engagement zone. Units that have never been told a Baneblade is in the area learn about its presence through the percussion in their chests. The hull-mounted Demolisher cannon handles a different problem set entirely. The close-range work, the fortifications that need to stop existing, the armored vehicles that made the tactical error of closing to what they imagined was a safe engagement distance. The Demolisher doesn't discriminate between building and armor. It applies the same kinetic argument to both. The architecture of these weapons firing simultaneously on different planes, at different ranges, against different threat categories is the design expression of a doctrine. The Baneblade doesn't participate in battles. It restructures them. Its presence reclassifies the entire engagement. Enemy armor has to answer the anti-armor systems. Enemy infantry has to answer the close-range weapons. Enemy titans have to answer the Mega Battle Cannon. And the Demolisher stands ready for whoever gets close enough to think the range differential might have helped them. No single opposing commander can allocate resources against the Baneblade without creating an exploitable gap against something else. The machine is designed to be the answer to every question the battlefield poses simultaneously, and to force the enemy into a tactical calculation that has no good resolution. 10 people make that possible. A crew of 10 human beings have divided this machine between them so completely and inhabited it so thoroughly that each person functions as an extension of the vehicle rather than an operator of it. 10 positions spanning command, driving, and multiple gun stations. The specific divisions of labor assign each person a portion of the Baneblade's perceptual field, and in aggregate, the 10 of them experience the battlefield the way the machine would experience it if the machine had consciousness. The commander processes the full tactical picture. The driver reads terrain at speed in a vehicle that weighs over 300 tons. The gunners manage firing solutions across multiple simultaneous threat vectors without the processing bandwidth to monitor what the other weapons are doing. The 10 of them function as a distributed nervous system for a machine too complex for any individual to operate alone. The question of what that does to a person isn't peripheral. It's the question the lore has been circling since the first stories set inside one of these machines were written. According to Black Library Fiction, Specifically, Sandy Mitchell's novel centered on the crew of the Mars Triumphant, a Baneblade deployed for the defense of the Kalidar system. Living inside one is a transformation rather than a job. The Baneblade imposes itself on the people inside it. It becomes the medium through which they understand scale and distance and threat geometry and safety. Every spatial relationship gets recalibrated to the machine's dimensions, its movement envelope, the particular vibrations of its drive systems and weapon discharges, the specific sounds that mean the engine is happy and the specific sounds that mean something needs immediate attention. The crew develops a sensory literacy specific to this machine that has no application anywhere else in their lives. The outside world becomes progressively harder to inhabit. It feels too exposed, too small in a way that's paradoxical, given the machine's enclosed interior is objectively more confining than open ground. Too quiet in the specific register of a silence that doesn't contain the Baneblade's running sounds. Wrong in a way that's genuinely difficult to communicate to anyone who hasn't spent extended time inside one. Mitchell's fiction treats the crew bond as the central subject rather than a backdrop, following 10 people whose relationship with the rest of existence has been permanently rewritten by the machine they operate. The evidence stops short of confirming precise passages from the novel that describe the specific mechanism of disruption, whether it's clinical disorientation, identity dissolution, or something closer to the grief the community intuits. And any specific claim from Black Library fiction requires that attribution, Black Library fiction, not codex or rules text, but the verified, fully sourced, canonically unambiguous proof of this psychological gravity doesn't require novel passages to demonstrate. It requires one name: Sebastian Yarick, Lord Commissar, hero of Hades Hive, the man who, after Orc war boss Ugelhard severed his right arm at the elbow with a power claw during the Second War for Armageddon in 941. M41 had the war boss's own claw removed and bolted in its place, then continued commanding. This is a person whose response to catastrophic combat injury is to repurpose the weapon that caused it as a prosthetic and return to the fight. The Orcs, according to lore, believe his gaze can kill, a belief Yarick has spent decades doing nothing to discourage. Because the psychological effect of an enemy who believes you can kill them with your eyes is tactically useful, and he's a very practical man underneath the myth-making. The Second War for Armageddon ended with the Orcs repelled and Yarick ascending from celebrated defender to living legend of the Imperial Guard. His Baneblade, the Fortress of Arrogance, had served as his command vehicle throughout. His mobile headquarters, his center of operations, the machine from which he directed the defense and counterattack that saved Armageddon. Then came Golgotha. The details are specific and worth staying with. Imperial forces were operating on Golgotha, an Orc-held world, and during the engagement, an Orc ambush brought down the Fortress of Arrogance. Astampa, one of the Orcs' own super-heavy walkers, crippled it. The tank that had carried Yarick through the Second War for Armageddon, the machine that had been his headquarters and his vantage point, and in some sense his operational identity, was disabled in enemy territory with Imperial forces in the process of being routed. When the retreat was called, Yarick had to leave it. The Fortress of Arrogance remained on Golgotha in Orc hands, sitting behind enemy lines on a world the Imperium no longer controlled, with no immediate prospect of recovery. Standard military reasoning in that situation is clean and inarguable. The world is lost. Surviving soldiers are finite assets that need to be preserved for future operations. Logistical chains are already strained from a losing campaign. The Fortress of Arrogance is a tank, a singular, irreplaceable STC-derived vehicle with deep personal and symbolic significance, but a tank. Write it off. Requisition a replacement through whatever mechanism a Lord Commissar uses to acquire new Baneblades, which is presumably a process involving multiple Adeptus Mechanicus approval chains, extensive documentation of the previous vehicle's loss, and a wait time measured in years. Mourn the Fortress of Arrogance in the manner appropriate to a lost piece of military equipment. Move forward. Yarrick sent soldiers back for it. Steve Parker's Black Library novel, Gunheads, covers the recovery operation in full. The point of view follows Sergeant Wolfe and his tank company, the Gunheads, as they are dispatched through hostile territory on Golgotha to locate the Fortress of Arrogance and bring it back. Parker's novel isn't primarily a tactical narrative about how you extract a disabled super-heavy tank from an orc-controlled planet while maintaining operational security and keeping your company alive. That happens. The mechanics of the retrieval are present, but the novel's actual subject is what a machine means to the people bonded to it, what it costs in lives and mission risk and strategic resource allocation when a commander's attachment to his vehicle outlasts the strategic logic that should have ended it. Yarrick didn't send the gunheads into orc territory for a piece of military hardware. He sent them for a bond that he couldn't rationalize through a standard cost-benefit analysis, but couldn't abandon either, because some relationships with machines don't respond to military logic. They respond to something older than military logic, something that the 10-person crew structure and the months spent inside the machine and the way it recalibrates your relationship to every other environment you've ever inhabited has created in the place where detachment should theoretically live. Sergeant Wolfe and the gunheads completed their mission. The Fortress of Arrogance was recovered. The Adeptus Mechanicus performed the restoration afterward. The careful, right-laden, methodical work of returning an STC-derived machine to full operational status, conducted by the faction most qualified on the planet to perform that work and most emotionally committed to doing it correctly. The rites, the litanies, the patient diagnosis and repair of every system the Stompa's attack had damaged and the subsequent months of orc captivity had degraded. The Mechanicus treated the Fortress of Arrogance the way it treats all Baneblades, as a sacred object that can be maintained but not truly understood, honored but never fully comprehended, preserved because the alternative is unconscionable. On 998 M41, 57 standard years to the day after the commencement of the Second War for Armageddon, the Fortress of Arrogance returned to active service. Yarrick's mobile headquarters, his command platform for the Third War for Armageddon, a tank that had been crippled in battle, abandoned on a hostile world, recovered by a company of soldiers at considerable risk, restored by priests who conducted the work as a religious obligation, and returned to the hands of the man who had committed all of those resources to ensuring that it survived. 57 years. The number is specific not because the date is a remarkable coincidence, but because lore sometimes gives you precise numbers that capture the shape of a person's relationship to something. Yarrick had been waiting for the Fortress of Arrogance across most of a human lifetime, and when it came back in time for another war on Armageddon, which is either the universe expressing a sense of narrative justice or Yarrick exercising the kind of deliberate timing that a man who wears a dead war boss's arm as a prosthetic tends to maintain. A competitor's video covered the Baneblade for 17 minutes and never mentioned any of this. Not Golgotha, not the gunheads, not Steve Parker, not the restoration, not 998.M41. A commenter wrote, "I can't believe you didn't mention the Fortress of Arrogance." That person was right, and the omission mattered, because the Yarrick arc isn't supplementary flavor, it's the thesis made literal, canonical, dated, published source proof that the Baneblade's psychological gravity is strong enough to override military logic, bend the strategic decisions of one of the Imperium's greatest commanders, and generate an entire Black Library novel about what that override costs. Every argument this video makes about crew bonds and machine devotion has Yarrick behind it as the verified anchor. The Steel Fury Baneblade companies are the tactical codification of the same understanding, approached from the doctrinal rather than the personal direction. Colonel Van Chester, an Imperial armor officer whose operational insights were eventually incorporated into the Tactica Imperium itself, making him one of the most cited military theorists in the Guard's entire institutional history, developed what he called the differential theorem of dispersed attrition. The practical expression of that theorem is straightforward in its logic. 3 to 5 Baneblades, formally constituted as a specific named formation, concentrating their combined firepower on a single enemy Titan until it stops functioning. Not an improvised grouping of available vehicles sharing an operational area. A deliberately structured company, formally constituted for a specific purpose, built around a mathematical understanding of multiplicative effectiveness that Van Segester understood well enough to write into the Tactica Imperium for all subsequent commanders to reference. The Steel Fury Company exists as official doctrine because Van Segester ran the numbers, and the numbers said that 3 to 5 Baneblades operating as a coherent unit represent a qualitatively different threat than the same machines working independently. The doctrine is explicit. The purpose is Titan killing. The formation is 3 to 5 tanks. The tabletop keyword that would enable that formation to operate as Van Chester intended is squadron. The Baneblade doesn't have it. That single absence makes the officially codified Tactica Imperium published doctrine for the Baneblade's primary combined arms role literally unplayable as designed. Van Chester wrote the theorem. The Tactica Imperium published it. The 10th edition datasheet ignores both. The Space Marine legions reached the same conclusion as Van Chester through their own operational experience, and their response was to build their own versions of the chassis rather than request allocation from the Guard's production. The Fellblade is the Legionis Astartes' answer to the Baneblade, a super-heavy tank built on the same foundational engineering logic, trusted by the same Golden Age STC principles, deployed by the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy for strategic purposes identical to those Van Chester codified in the Tactica Imperium. Where the standard Baneblade chassis represents the Guard's version of the concept, the Fellblade represents the Space Marines' version, adapted for the slightly different tactical context of a legion that operates in much smaller numbers than the Astra Militarum, but at much higher individual unit effectiveness. The Glaive takes the chassis and substitutes a different primary weapon configuration, maintaining the fundamental armored superiority while addressing specific threat profiles with alternative armament. The Falchion extends the concept further still, another Baneblade chassis super heavy, adapted for the most demanding armored operations the Legionis Astartes faced. Because when you need to answer the heaviest threats on the battlefield, the STC chassis is the platform you build that answer on. These are Forge World products, living primarily in the Horus Heresy rules ecosystem, and their existence confirms what the STC origins already implied. This chassis was universal enough, reliable enough, and destructive enough that the Emperor's own Space Marine legions looked at what the Guard had and decided they wanted their own version. The Legionis Astartes don't generally adopt human equipment. They went to the trouble of adapting the Baneblade chassis for Legion use, which is the strongest available institutional endorsement of the design's fundamental correctness. The competitor's video mentioned none of these variants. The lore corrector segment of the comments section, the 5 to 6% who arrived specifically to audit coverage for omissions, noticed immediately. They were justified. The Fellblade, Glaive, and Falchion aren't obscure supplementary products that casual fans shouldn't be expected to know. They're the evidence that multiple military traditions across human history independently concluded that the Baneblade chassis was the right foundation for the most demanding armored operations they faced. Covering the Baneblade without acknowledging its Space Marine variants is covering the design while omitting the most significant independent validation of its importance. The community's engagement with the Baneblade didn't stay at admiration. Pete the Wargamer, a YouTube creator whose platform centers on the kind of deep hobby engagement that the Baneblade seems to generate in everyone who spends serious time with it, designed the Stormsaber, a community-created Baneblade variant. The specific weapons loadout and design brief are best verified directly on Pete's channel, since the source record here doesn't confirm armament details at the level required to state them as established fact. What the record confirms, and what's sufficient for the argument, is the fact itself. A community creator loved this machine enough to design an entirely new variant for it. Without a Games Workshop commission, without compensation, as an act of creative devotion to a kit that generates that kind of response in people who engage with it seriously. The competitor's video missed this entirely, and its absence mattered to the audience that knew about it, because the Storm Saber represents something the competitor's celebration-only framing couldn't have accommodated anyway. Fan-designed variants aren't something you create for machines you merely appreciate. They're something you create for machines you're devoted to, machines that have earned enough of your imagination that the official product line feels like an incomplete expression of what the machine deserves. Games Workshop charges premium prices for the physical kit. Community members design free variants for it in their own time. The institutional and the devoted are pulling in opposite directions, and it's been this way for long enough that the gap has become visible in the rules. The Dawn of War ecosystem is where the Baneblade's cultural standing crystallized most durably in the broader public. The voice line became a meme not because anyone engineered it for viral circulation, but because the game had the intelligence to give the Baneblade appropriate weight. Relic Unit Status, a designation the game used to categorically separate certain units from normal forces. When the Baneblade finally appeared on the field, its arrival was treated as an event, not another unit rotating into the tactical mix, but a shift in the emotional temperature of the engagement. The announcement voice line matched that register. "It is the Baneblade." Doesn't sound like a status notification. It sounds like a religious experience. Because Relic Entertainment understood what the machine meant to the setting and gave its introduction a weight proportional to that understanding. The comment with 598 likes on the competitor's video didn't summarize the lore or describe the rules. It quoted the voice line. Because the voice line is the Baneblade experience most players genuinely want. The moment where the machine arrives and everything reorganizes around its presence. And when a game delivers that experience with the appropriate gravity, the memory of it persists for decades. The Lehman Russ counterfeit gag lives in the same cultural register, the community's collective response to the absurdity of treating a Baneblade as roughly comparable in category to vehicles that are fundamentally different in scale, purpose, and lore significance. The joke is about compression. What happens when a rule system flattens something that resists flattening? When the points math treats the Imperium's most ancient super heavy as a premium-priced option rather than a battlefield-defining event. The punchline writes itself because the compression is real. And the 171 likes that joke accumulated isn't enthusiasm for a clever reference. It's recognition. The community recognized in the joke the shape of its own frustration. The tabletop prosecution begins with the accuracy stat, because the accuracy stat is where the frustration becomes quantifiable. Ballistic skill 4+. The Baneblade's primary weapon system, the Mega Battle Cannon, engineered during humanity's golden age, maintained by priests who treat the engineering schematics as holy scripture, misses half its shots without external assistance. That baseline is already a difficult number to defend for a unit at this price point, but community discussion of 10th edition balance changes adds a specific layer of insult to it. Community discussion references the Baneblade going from hitting 75% of the time to hitting 58% at best following a data slate adjustment. Parse that carefully. At some point in 10th edition's lifespan, Games Workshop reviewed the Baneblade's accuracy stat, determined that 75% was too effective, and deliberately reduced it. The ancient weapon got nerfed in current edition. Van Segester's theorem about concentrated firepower depends on firepower you can rely on landing. The data slate made that reliability worse on purpose, and the community's response was extensive and specific enough to generate dedicated discussion threads breaking down the exact percentage impact of the change. The accuracy stat is a significant problem. The orders problem is architectural. Astra Militarum in 10th edition is built around orders with a completeness that makes orders the actual definition of the faction's identity, not a supplement layered over it. Every guardsman squad, every heavy weapons team, every major unit in the range is designed assuming orders will be in play. Orders are why a lasgun contributes meaningfully to a battle. Orders are the command layer that transforms a collection of individually undertuned units into a cohesive force with a strategic identity. They're why someone chooses the Astra Militarum over armies with superficially stronger individual unit profiles. Because the faction's power lives in its command structure, in the way orders enable coordinated action at a scale that overrides individual unit limitations. Remove orders from Astra Militarum, and you haven't weakened the faction. You've described a different faction, one that doesn't work. At a specific point in 10th edition, confirmed by community discussion even if the precise data slate timing requires production verification, the Baneblade was excluded from receiving orders. Community discussion characterized it as kind of massive, disciplined understatement. Removing the Baneblade from orders access doesn't degrade a buff. It removes the vehicle from the faction identity it's supposed to participate in. The Baneblade exists as an Astra Militarum unit. The Astra Militarum is an Orders army. Excluding the most expensive and most visually dominant kit in the range from the mechanic that defines the range's identity is structurally identical to designing a Space Marine captain who can't access chapter tactics. The comparison carries no hyperbole. Both describe a unit categorically removed from the system that defines its faction, not weakened within that system, but architecturally excluded from it. Now, the critical caveat. Because this script has an obligation to current accuracy, a Reddit thread from late 2024 titled, "Baneblades Can Get Orders Again, Let's Go," suggests a balance, data slate, restored orders access after it was removed. If you're watching this in the current rules window, verify on Wahapedia and drop the current state in the comments. The argument is always stronger when it reflects the live game state, and if the order's exclusion has been reversed, that's material. But the restoration doesn't close the argument, it confirms it. Games Workshop removed the Baneblade from Astra Militarum's defining faction mechanic. The community pushed back. Eventually, the change was reversed. That sequence of events, removal, response, restoration, demonstrates that the error was recognized as an error, which means it was an error that should never have been made. The restoration being achievable doesn't make the original decision defensible. It makes the original decision more legible, as a symptom of a larger incoherence between the people writing the lore and the people writing the datasheet. The squadron keyword problem hasn't been addressed by any data slate. The Baneblade lacks the squadron keyword in 10th edition. The precision of the irony embedded in that absence is worth dwelling on. Van Chester's differential theorem of dispersed attrition, formally published in the Tactica Imperium, the official doctrinal text of the Imperial military, explicitly specifies fielding 3 to 5 Baneblades as a concentrated unit to destroy Titans. This doctrine has a name, Van Chester's theorem. It has an author, Colonel Van Chester, whose insights the Tactica Imperium preserved because they were too important to leave to individual commanders' discretion. It has a formation structure, 3 to 5 tanks operating as a coherent unit, each multiplying the effectiveness of the others. The Steel Fury Baneblade Company is a formally constituted military organization with a specific, officially stated purpose, and the purpose is Titan killing through concentrated, coordinated fire. This is what the Baneblade is for, according to the Tactica Imperium. 3 to 5 together. The keyword that would allow that formation to function as designed on the tabletop is squadron. The datasheet omits it. The community has already done the design reasoning, articulated with clarity in a wishlist thread. Baneblade gets squadron, or all Baneblade variants drop 40 to 50 points. Both of those solutions address the same problem. The second solution is the acceptable compromise. The first is the right answer. Neither has been implemented, and the gap between Van Chester's theorem and the 10th edition datasheet remains open. Before closing the prosecution, the Steelman deserves its fairest possible hearing, and it has genuine substance. Community rules discussion puts the Baneblade cannon's AP at -2. On targets with a 2+ save, that penalty would drop their save to a 4+, which represents a meaningful increase in wounds getting through to the target. The chassis itself offers a high toughness value with a 2+ save on the defensive profile. meaning the Baneblade is absorbing incoming fire that would catastrophically damage lighter vehicles without registering as a serious threat. The Daka community made this argument directly. Baneblade chassis are the second most competitive super heavy chassis there is. It does not need any kind of buff. 10 to 15 points for T9 and 2+ save. The argument has real substance. A strong AP value against properly armored targets is a genuine contribution to the fight. The durability profile means the investment doesn't evaporate in one bad turn. Calling the Baneblade simply broken misses what it does well on the table. The problem is the frame. If the question is, does the Baneblade function as a tabletop unit, then that AP value and a 2+ save is a defensible answer. If the question is, does the Baneblade perform the way the most ancient and celebrated super heavy in the Imperium's arsenal should perform, which is the question the lore, the doctrine, the Black Library canon, and the community consistently demands when they buy and paint the 316-ton model, then a P-2 without orders represents a permanently degraded version of what a P-2 with orders would achieve. The degraded version is the baseline. Van Seegester wrote an entire named theorem about multiplicative effectiveness, about what happens when the Baneblades work together as a doctrine-specified formation. The current rules deny the multiplication and omit the formation. The Steelman survives the binary useful versus useless test. It fails the does this match what the lore says about what the machine is supposed to be doing test. And that's the test the community is actually running when they load the model into their list and discover that the rules don't match the machine. The counter-argument that all super heavies share these restrictions, that orders exclusion and squadron absence affect the entire category, making the Baneblade situation typical rather than exceptional, sounds reasonable until you follow it to its conclusion. If the entire super heavy category is systematically excluded from orders access and squadron keyword synergies, then the problem isn't a single unit oversight. It's a category-level design philosophy that has separated the most visually dominant, most lore-significant, most expensive models in the Astra Militarum range from the mechanics that give the faction its identity. That's worse than one unit being underperforming. A category-level decision that orphans the entire super heavy roster from faction mechanics is a declaration, however unintentional, that nobody in the design process is maintaining the relationship between what the lore says these vehicles are and what the rules say they do. Framing this as a defense is actually a confession. If the entire super heavy category is mechanically separated from the faction it belongs to, and the Baneblade is the most iconic model in that category, then the defense that all super heavies are in the same situation proves the charge rather than answering it. The prosecution has never argued that GW singled out the Baneblade for unique mistreatment. The prosecution is that GW made a category-level design decision, and the Baneblade is where that decision is most visible and most costly in terms of community trust. Because the Baneblade is the model that the community has invested the most in, emotionally, financially, culturally, and the gap between that investment and the rules return on its largest here. A commenter in the competitors section framed it with 52 likes and the kind of precision that suggests the observation had been sitting with them for a while. GW makes said tank really bad in the actual game, not just competitively, but with oddly disjointed rules. Disjointed. That's the word that lands. The gap between the Baneblade of the lore and the Baneblade of the datasheet isn't a balanced philosophy disagreement. It's a coherence failure, a breakdown between the people who write the fiction and the people who write the rules, a disconnect that produces a unit whose canonical identity and mechanical identity are operating in separate documents with no apparent cross-reference. The lore says, oldest STC design in active service, maintained by priests, produced in the tens of thousands during humanity's golden age, deployed in doctrine-mandated Titan-killing formations of 3 to 5, codified by a named author in the official military text of the entire faction. crewed by 10 people who form bonds with the machine so profound that, according to Black Library fiction, they become psychologically disrupted upon leaving. Commanded most famously by a man who sent a company of soldiers into Orc-controlled territory to recover his specific tank by name, then waited 57 years for it to be restored before taking it back to war. The rules have delivered at various points across 10th edition. A nerfed accuracy stat that makes the main cannon miss more than half the time, removal from the defining faction mechanic, and absence of the keyword that makes the Tactica Imperium's own published doctrine unplayable as written. Those two documents, the lore and the datasheet, are describing different machines. The community already designed the fix, squadron keyword restored, orders access confirmed and maintained, points cost calibrated to reflect what the machine is supposed to do rather than what the current rules have permitted it to do. 3 adjustments, all of them articulated in plain language in a forum post. The design work exists without requiring a dedicated playtesting team or a significant budget allocation. The reasoning is in Van Chester's theorem. The precedent is in the Yarick arc. The community has done the advocacy. What remains is institutional will from the company that owns the intellectual property and charges collector prices for the kit. Yarick had institutional will. He demonstrated it in the specific, expensive, humanly costly form of committing soldiers' lives to a recovery operation on a planet the Imperium no longer controlled, for a tank that every element of standard military reasoning said to write off. He held the thread across decades, across the years of waiting, across the logistical complexity of a retrieval mission behind enemy lines, across the long, careful process of Adeptus Mechanicus restoration, until the Fortress of Arrogance returned to service in 998 M41, 57 years to the day after the war that took it from him. He wasn't rational about the Fortress of Arrogance. He was devoted to it. The distinction between rationality and devotion is exactly the gap the lore identifies as the core of the crew bond, and Yarick is the canonical, dated, sourced proof that this gap exists and has real military and narrative consequences. The Baneblade has always asked for that kind of irrational devotion from the people engaging with it, from the crews in the fiction, from the commanders in the lore, from the players at the table, from the hobbyists at the painting desk at 1 in the morning. Sandy Mitchell wrote an entire novel exploring it. Steve Parker wrote an entire novel about the cost of it. The Dawn of War team gave the vehicle a voice line that sounds like the announcement of a minor deity because they understood what the machine meant to the people inside the setting. Pete the Wargamer designed a new variant for it in his own time because the existing official variants weren't enough to contain what the community wanted to express. 292 people liked a comment that said the outside world would become unlivable after time inside one, and they liked it because it was true, not factually verifiable in a codex, but emotionally true in the way that the best community observations are true, recognizing something real about what the machine represents and what leaving it behind would feel like. According to Black Library fiction, and according to the psychological logic that runs through every canonical piece of lore about this machine, the crews go insane after leaving. The bond is architectural. 10 people divided inside a steel world that hums and vibrates and smells of promethium and hot metal don't experience that environment as an occupational assignment. They experience it as home, as identity, as the medium through which existence makes sense. The outside world becomes too quiet, too exposed, too far removed from the scale at which the Baneblade operates. The mountain shattering is inside. The boring, stinky, non-mountain shattering humanity is outside. And once you've been inside, outside never fully recovers its adequacy. Games Workshop charges premium prices for the kit. The community has responded with an outpouring of devotion that produced novels, memes accumulating hundreds of likes, community-designed variants built in creators' spare time, and 17-minute celebration videos that end with commenters pointing out everything they didn't cover. The lore has given the machine its most celebrated commander, and its most celebrated vehicle in one unified arc, complete with dates and published sources and a black library novel about the cost of the bond. Yarick understood that some machines are worth any cost to retrieve. He proved it with the gunheads, with the decades of waiting, with the restoration, with the return on 998.m41. The question this video closes on is whether Games Workshop will extend to its most iconic kit the same devotion that its own lore says the crew extends to the vehicle, or whether the Baneblade will remain what it has sometimes been in 10th edition, the most celebrated vehicle in the Imperium's long decline, benched on Tuesday game nights because the points math doesn't justify the heartache. The crews go insane after leaving. The Black Library says so. The community with 292 likes intuited it without prompting. Yarick proved it with soldiers' lives and 57 years of waiting. Honestly, same. That's why this still stings. Subscribe, there's more where this came from.